Hi, you are in the ladies' room with Dr. Donica, the only public ladies' room you can enter anytime without ever waiting online. I'm your host, Dr. Donica Moore. We'll be having real conversations with real women about really intimate issues. They may be embarrassing, sad, or funny, but they will always be interesting and informative. You know, like the best conversations you've had in ladies' rooms with your best friends, or total strangers and a physician. Please join us. Hello, and welcome to another exciting episode of In the Ladies' Room with Dr. Donica. Today, my guest is my first ever rabbi in the ladies' room, Rabbi Robin Nafshi, otherwise known as Rabbi Robin. So we have Rabbi Robin with Dr. Donica. She was ordained by Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in 2005, but that was after she had already become a lawyer. So we want to hear about that transition. She's a graduate of both NYU and Cornell Law School. She worked in the San Francisco Bay Area as an attorney, legal editor, and legal author before attending rabbinical school. And you are now where?
Concord, New Hampshire.
Yay. And you had a stint in New Jersey, which is where our paths cross. Rabbi Robin is also a mother. And as our first rabbi in the ladies' room, I have to acknowledge that we're taping this just literally several days after the horrific massacre in Pittsburgh at Tree of Life Synagogue. And so I would be remiss if I did not ask you for some spiritual advice on healing. And I have to say, as a Jewish woman, I have to honestly say I am not any more horrified about this than I have been by the other mass shooting massacres in our country. And maybe it affects me a little bit more because now it's my people. But of course, this is not the first time our people have been targeted. I would also be remiss if I didn't say that today, the day we're taping this, is the 307th day of the year of 2018. And there have already been 304 mass shootings this year alone in the United States. So this is clearly a problem. How are you coping with your congregants and even yourself?
Yeah, it's tough. It's really hard. We've done a lot of work toward moments of healing, at least liturgically and spiritually. So when I heard about the massacre on Saturday, I immediately thought, tomorrow morning we have religious school. This is an opportunity, one, to speak to our kids, but more importantly, to reassure them of their safety, because that's what we knew was going to be the first place. And that for the kids who were aware, and there are some parents who have chosen not to share the information yet with their very young kids. I mean, very young as in K1, 2. Once you hit probably third grade and older, our kids are all pretty aware. So what we decided to do was to hold a healing service during the hour that we dedicate toward prayer, when the kids would usually come together to study their prayers. Instead, our clergy, my partner who is our cantor, Jewish clergy who leads through music, we put together a healing service Saturday night. And that was what we did in that block of hour. And sent an email. I sent an email to the entire congregation on Saturday night, inviting everybody to join us during that 10 o'clock hour. And we had a pretty full sanctuary. We had about 140 people there.
Wow.
Now we have about 35 kids in our religious school, plus about 17 teens and 14 kids in our weekly pre-K class. And some of the pre-K families stayed with their young ones as well, figuring that they didn't really understand what was going on, but the parents themselves needed the healing. The response from the congregation was wonderful. People very, very, very moved and touched that we got something together so quickly, and found our choices of readings and music to provide them with a little bit of the comfort they were seeking. Later that evening, an organization in our community called the Kent Street Coalition, it's a multi-faith group of people who do peacekeeping. So at vigils and rallies and things that are held in Concord, they are always there as a peacekeeping presence. And Concord is the state capital, so we do a lot of vigils and rallies and marches here. But they had organized a vigil, a candlelight vigil, just through word of mouth and social media. A few hundred people came to that. Again, my partner, our cantor, and I were invited to open it in whatever way we deemed appropriate to speak or sing for as long as we wished to. And then it was just an open mic for anybody who had a poem to share, a prayer to offer, a song. And many people stepped forward, some from the faith communities, some outside the communities. And then we closed with music again. And again, the feeling was a very sense of comfort. To a degree, one is able to be comforted in this, that there was some degree of comfort. We were really quite moved at how many people were there from the non-Jewish community.
I've been very impressed with that all over. I'm hearing about multi-denominational services, and I'm loving these photographs that I'm seeing on social media of all the church signboards out front of various churches that just say shalom.
Well, this past Friday night, I dedicated Friday night and Saturday morning's worship also to a sense of healing and wholeness to the extent one is able, as well as remembering those who had been murdered and praying for the health and well-being of the 4 officers and 2 others who are injured and in the hospital. And when I came to synagogue on Friday night, there was a neighbor of ours standing outside with a sign that simply said, "We love our Jewish neighbors." Inside the sanctuary, by the time the service began, there were 250 people, about half members of our congregation and half people from the larger community. The Kent Street Coalition was there again, 11 of them standing vigil. The police were coming by. They stopped by at least 3 times that night. Saturday morning, I had 50 people for services, about half congregation, half not. And these days, I struggle to get 10 or 12 people on a Saturday morning. So 50 was incredible.
Well, I think that's one of there's so many levels of horror of this situation. Right. But one of the levels of horror is, of course, every temple has their, quote unquote, regulars, right, who are the ones who are the 10 people that make up the required minyan. And all of the people who were killed were the regulars at this particular temple. I'm sorry?
I was going to say, we also, the Jewish community is so small and so intertwined. Friday night before I offered my sermon, one of our congregants spoke about her connection. She grew up in Pittsburgh in Squirrel Hill. Her mother still lives there. Her sister and her family still live there. And, between herself and her relatives in Pittsburgh, they knew most of the victims. And so she spoke very beautifully and eloquently about it. At a congregation 20 minutes to our south, there's 2 families directly affected. The brother-in-law and sister-in-law of one of the victims are members there. And then the cousins of the 2 brothers who were murdered are also members there. So it's so close. And even myself, I did a writing retreat in the summer of 2017. My writing instructor's husband is the rabbi of New Light congregation, the second conservative synagogue that shares its space. And she's an eloquent writer, published many times, and her Facebook page on Sunday simply said, "My family and I are physically fine. 3 members of our congregation were murdered. I have nothing more to say." And so
it's horrible. And, if you think about it, we talk about our connections to this tragedy or to Squirrel Hill or to Pittsburgh. But the fact is, it is very difficult to find an American right now who does not personally know or is personally connected to any one of the mass shootings.
Absolutely.
And as I said, there was 304 this year alone. That doesn't count the massacre in Las Vegas or the massacre in Orlando or the massacre in Parkland at a high school or
Charleston.
I'm sorry?
Charleston, 3.5 years ago, at Mother Emanuel.
Yes. And that was devastating. And then it's so frustrating to hear the responses of people offering their thoughts and prayers. Well, these people were praying at the time that it happened. But I have to say, I've been extremely touched by reports on social media and offers of particularly Muslims who are ex-military or current police officers who've offered to provide temple security, for free on their off-duty times.
So, And you started off by asking me a little bit about how does one heal through something like this. The level of healing that will take place in Pittsburgh is its own story. I think for the rest of us, though, I always like to say that we have to look to hope, and that there is always hope for the future. I like to use the expression, the Jew lives with hope, always. Without it, we're nothing. I think of Israel's national anthem, Hatikva, literally means the hope. And that's a statement of who we are. We have to live like that. And the fact that we have all of these people, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, Baha'i, Taoist, non-religious, showing up and being with us and standing with us and asking how they can help, it is really what allows us to move on and wake up the next day and do the work we need to do. For me,
that's the silver lining.
Yeah, it is. And for me personally, I had a congregant come up to me yesterday morning at religious school, and he said, you're here taking care of all of us. How can my family take care of yours? I thought maybe this week we could do your grocery shopping for you or something like that. And it was the sweetest response.
Awesome.
And that's what brings a smile to my face and reminds me of all the goodness in the world. And that's what I like to focus on.
Well, my grandmother used to say, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what we have to do. But you're also a mother, and you have a very young daughter.
35 in January.
And so is she not aware of this? Have you discussed this with her?
She is not aware of this. We chose not to share with her. There'll be a time that we need to have the conversation that will sort of burst her bubble of not everyone is safe to be around. Not everyone cares about other people. And she is so trusting. And, she grows up as a congregation kid. Mm-hmm. So she just can walk into that congregation and anybody will put their arms around her. And it was one day a few weeks ago, she was at services with me and my partner wasn't there. There was really no other kids there. She recognized one family she knew. It was a father with his 12-year-old son who's studying to become a bar mitzvah. And she just walked right over to them and sat herself down in a chair in between the two of them. And they essentially took care of her and watched her through the whole service. And
that's awesome.
Right. And so she still lives with that sense that people are good, people like me, I can trust them. And we know we'll have that conversation with her at some point. We don't need to bust her bubble at 4. We'll wait a little while. We'll wait. But, I talk to a lot of parents in the congregation whose kids are a similar age. And some of them, their kids picked up on it. One 4-year-old boy who was there at the service, at the end of our healing service during religious school, said to his parents, what exactly happened? What's Pittsburgh? Where, because I wasn't using explicit language. I didn't want the third graders going home with nightmares.
Right.
I talked about Pittsburgh. I talked about tragedy.
What about the women in their late 50s going home with nightmares?
Well, there's that too. But we know how, we sometimes know how to deal with it. Or at least, we're not going to traumatize the rest of our families necessarily. But, those kids, we had one kid at religious school we also hold on Monday nights. And last Monday, I got an email from a mom saying, my kid spent the day in the guidance counselor's office. She was so traumatized by Pittsburgh, and she's afraid to go to Temple tonight to come to Hebrew school class. And so she said, I'm going to bring her, and she's going to be there, but you should just know that. And so I sat with my students, and I just talked to them, and I said, what do you want to ask? What do you want to know? And a few of them were asking about safety and security in the synagogue. Here they are, 12 years old, and they want to know what steps we have taken to make this.
So what steps have you taken, or have you taken any?
We have many in leadership, both professional and lay, including many of our teachers have attended an active shooter training with the local police department. We have done walkthroughs of our building with the local police. And in fact, the lieutenant who did the walkthrough has been stopping by, just parking himself outside the building a few times, letting us know he's there, just to let us know he's keeping an eye on us. There's a number of things we need to undergo. Our doors are very hard to install locks in, but we're going to be putting locks in all of our school rooms. We have glass windows that can look into each room. We know we need to put a shade over them that can be dropped easily. Our teachers need to be trained as to where the best place to hide. Our classrooms are
so horrifying.
kind of very weirdly shaped, and so there's actually a lot of hiding space. It sounds horrifying, but I was talking yesterday during religious club. I was actually talking with our teens, with our older kids. They're all used to it. They do it in school. I mean, my brother's a little older than I am, so he still remembers duck and cover for, nuclear stuff.
I remember that. And we had to go down into we actually had a bomb shelter in the basement.
Right. But these are kids who are growing up and they have active shooter trainings in their schools, middle school.
Both of my kids have had active shooters on their college campuses when they were there. And we could talk about this all day. We probably should have just changed the topic, but it kind of reminds me of after the Columbine shooting. I was actually at NBC at the time, and I was doing a segment on the Later Today show on osteoporosis. And I had to follow the breaking news about Columbine. And I just got on air and I just said, how do we do this? What's the segue? And the segue was the same segue I used after 9/11, which was, as horrifying and dramatic as this is, there are still people who have everyday medical problems that are their own battles that they have to deal with and that they're struggling with. And we can multitask. We can talk about both. That was the best I had.
Can I add to it? A lot of those everyday medical things, particularly the two I have, are exacerbated by stress.
Yes.
So when we experience these horrific tragedies, and if we are the people who are meant to be the spiritual counselors to them, or the medical counselors to them, or the psychological counselor, whatever it is, we also recognize the increased stress in ourselves, as well as those who are reacting naturally to what's happening in the larger world. And that often exacerbates whatever our medical conditions are.
Absolutely. And people
learn really how to balance it all.
Yeah. So people who are naturally more empathetic are also at greater risk for increased stress. I actually saw an incredible tweet from a woman who said, is it possible to die of a rage attack? And I said, yes, but what we call those things are heart attacks, strokes, migraines, angina, panic attacks, anxiety disorders, etc. So, of course, for the millions of people who are living with autoimmune diseases, which is what we're going to talk about, stress is a huge exacerbating factor. So what we're going to talk about today are two autoimmune conditions, or one autoimmune condition and one question mark. Is it really an autoimmune condition, or is it a fibromuscular condition, or all of the above? We're going to talk about Sjogren syndrome, and we're going to talk about fibromyalgia. So tell us a little bit about your experience with both of those, when you were diagnosed, what your symptoms were, etc.
So it was a very challenging trip I took in terms of the beginning stages of my autoimmune conditions. I was on a cruise ship back in the summer of 2001. 2001. And one night I noticed I had a very unusual rash. What am I, up in here, lower neck, upper chest area. And it was beginning to get worse and worse. And at the end of the cruise, I came home and I went to see a dermatologist. And the dermatologist said, I'm not sure exactly what it is. It looks almost like ringworm, because it was the round shape of it, he said. So he gave me a topical for it. It didn't work at all. In fact, I had an allergic reaction to the first topical. They tried a second one. It also didn't work. And he said, I'm really befuddled. I have no idea what it is. What I'd like to do is send you to my professor of dermatology from when I was in medical school, who's the head of dermatology at one of the big New York hospitals. So I went in and I saw the guy, and he took a look at it and he said, you'll be amazed, but I don't think it's anything more than psoriasis.
Hey.
I said, oh. he said, but let me do some blood work on you. And so he gave me something to treat the psoriasis, and it mostly went away. But he also did blood work, and it came back and he said, you have a very elevated rheumatoid factor. This means that someday you may develop some kind of an autoimmune condition of connective tissue. The most well-known one is rheumatoid arthritis, but there are many others. And okay, he said, so, what you want to do is probably have your blood checked every 6 months, see your PCP, see if you're, what's going on. So I was doing that, and I was having my blood checked, and every time it would come back, there's still a very elevated rheumatoid factor. And I didn't seem to be symptomatic. And I was in rabbinical school when this happened. It was the early 2000s. And a few years later, it was 2004, I remember taking a subway from downtown New York to Midtown, where I had a class that met off campus, and every week feeling like I was going to just fall asleep on the subway. I was so exhausted. I would stop at Starbucks before I got on the train. I'd get off the train. I'd stop at another Starbucks to keep me awake through the class. And it was a good class. It wasn't a class I was likely to fall asleep in. And so that was the first thing I began to notice. And then all of a sudden one day, all of my knuckles and my fingers felt as though I had bruised them. And every time I bent my hands, either one of them, they were stiff and achy and felt bruised. And I happened to be working in a synagogue as a student, and one of the bar mitzvah kids came in for a lesson, and it just so happened that his mother was a rheumatologist. And I mentioned something to
Talk about networking.
Yeah, really. I mentioned something to her, and she said, please come into my office, make an appointment. And I did. And as she gave me an exam, she said to me, my conclusion is that you have undifferentiated autoimmune condition of the connective tissue. She said, here are the multiple kinds of symptoms you might begin to have over the next couple of months or years.
And undifferentiated means it hasn't yet fully manifested itself, so we don't know which boxes to check to make the precise diagnosis. Right.
So she said, you're going to look for joint pain. You're going to look for, if you begin to develop any kind of, in fact, joint, where your joints now begin to look a little skewed, and, you've got, your fingers are looking a little wacky. She said you could develop rashes on your body. She said you might experience dryness in parts of your body, and all these different things. Well, yes, the rashes started coming on, and she said, well, that could point to psoriatic arthritis.
Did you connect it, by the way, with the rash that you had in 2001?
Most definitely. And she said, that psoriasis rash you had back then may have actually been a manifestation of something psoriatic arthritis. And then one day I woke up and I couldn't open my eyes. They were so dry.
Yeah.
And I called her, and she said, well, the dryness, keep an eye on that. That's something called Sjogren syndrome. And, and then that would go away. And, it was the very unusual, many months, year of time. I eventually, for whatever reasons, changed rheumatologists. And in the process of changing rheumatologists, when I went to her and she did an exam, she said, well, at the moment, you're not really showing symptoms of any of the connective tissue disorder. They seem to be in a little bit of remission. She said, but what I'm seeing in your body now is fibromyalgia. And she said, and it's very, very common that fibromyalgia comes hand in hand with a connective tissue autoimmune condition. She said, most of my patients that have some autoimmune connective tissue disorder, she said, most of the women also have fibromyalgia.
So just for people who are listening, fibromyalgia is a systemic chronic pain syndrome. And when we use this word syndrome, we use it in medicine to denote a condition that's diagnosed by its symptoms as opposed to a blood test or an x-ray or something like that. So what we find are very tender spots in very classic reproducible locations on both sides of the body that we can almost map out with precision. And not everybody has all of the spots, but most people have multiple locations. And it's also associated with disordered sleep.
Right.
Now, fibromyalgia can be what we call primary, which means that there's no other reason for it, or secondary, which means it's associated with another condition. So very often associated with other autoimmune diseases, or can happen as a result of having had infections like Lyme disease or another syndrome such as chronic fatigue syndrome. They can also go together very often.
So at that point I was being treated for fibromyalgia, and a few months later, the dryness in my body began to manifest pretty continuously, and with dry eye and dry mouth. And at that point, my doctor said, it looks like you really have now differentiated to Sjogren syndrome. And Sjogren's, it's interesting how you just described fibromyalgia as a syndrome. Sjogren's is often similarly, and I think that's why it's called syndrome, because not all of us test positive for the blood antibodies for Sjogren's. And that my current rheumatologist, because I moved up to New Hampshire, she says 40 to 50% of the patients actually don't even test positive for Sjogren's. You just do it again through symptoms. So my diagnosis is through symptoms. I have pretty severe dry mouth. I have dry eye. I get dryness in multiple parts of my body. I still do occasionally get little rashes that may just be probably more just psoriasis than psoriatic arthritis. Luckily, I don't have any deformity in my joints. I do get joint pain, which is one of the reasons I think it falls into the same category with those other connective tissue disorders, because it's not just the dryness, it's also the joint pain. And so I live with
about joint pain. That's kind of in the arthritis family. Right. Fibromyalgia, right. I just want to distinguish that's muscular pain.
Right. So I live with both. But
you can have more than one thing.
Yeah, I live with joint pain and muscular pain and the dryness. And mostly, again, as I say, the dryness for me is dry eyes and dry mouth.
And so how do you treat this?
Well, I see a lot of different doctors. I have to see an ophthalmologist at least yearly for my eyes. I see a dentist 4 times a year because with as dry as my mouth is, the plaque buildup is pretty severe. Luckily, my insurance, if you have certain conditions, you're automatically covered for 4 cleanings a year. And Sjogren syndrome is one of them with my insurance. So I have to see the dentist. I see my rheumatologist usually twice a year, and she's just keeping an eye on things and how I'm doing. I get massages regularly. I have to. They are therapeutic massages. Without them, the muscle pain would be almost debilitating. And
is that covered by your insurance?
My doctor writes me a prescription for it, and so while my insurance doesn't pay for it, I pay for it out of my health savings account.
Okay,
that's I have a prescription for it, and no one, I've never been challenged by the IRS or anybody else, and I really good of
massage in some states is covered by insurance if it's by a licensed provider.
Right.
In states like New Jersey, that's a problem because New Jersey doesn't have a state licensure for massage therapists. However, there are some people who have another kind of license, like RNs, who then become massage therapists, or a physical therapist who also do massage therapy, and then it could be covered by your insurance.
I have had great, actually, physical therapy. When I lived in New Jersey, one of the hospitals offered aquatic physical therapy. So you almost felt like a spawning fish. It was like a lock system between, when you have like a lake and a river that are different heights, and you take a boat and it goes between and you have to go through a lock. That's what this hospital had. You would step into one piece of it. They'd close the door behind you, open a second door, the water would fill in, then you'd go into where the treadmill was, they'd close the door behind you and the water would refill, and then you would be on the treadmill for as long
underwater treadmill.
Underwater, which is so much easier on your body when you have fibromyalgia. I have looked, there is actually nowhere in the state of New Hampshire where they have aquatic physical therapy for humans. If I was a dog, I could find physical therapy in New Hampshire, but not for humans.
So what I can recommend is check out your local Y, whether it's a YMCA or a YWHA or anything in between. The National Arthritis Foundation does have an aquatic program that they coordinate through the Ys. And most of them don't have underwater treadmills, but it's sort of gentle water exercise, which I actually have tested this program, and it's very impressive.
Yeah, they have it at our Y. There's also there's a couple of private health clubs in town with pools that have some other kinds of things. So those are most of the things that I do for my physical body. I do take one medication for dry mouth called Evoxac, Evoxac. It is fairly helpful. Actually, my insurance doesn't pay for the name brand, so I'm on a generic, which is less effective with me. And all the appeals letters from my doctors, dentists, and myself have not allowed, they still will not pay for the drug in the name brand, and it is extremely expensive. I can't afford it without the appeal or without the insurance. So I take the generic. It's helpful. It's not great. I do some other things. There's something I came across. I belong to the Sjogren Syndrome Foundation, and I get the newsletter, and there's usually products in there that I'm willing to give a try once. Right now, I take something else called Basic Bites.
What is that?
It's this little square, big. It's chocolate, so it tastes good, right? And it's something they recommend that you let dissolve so that you can, and to the point where you can swallow it whole, that you do it morning and evening after brushing your teeth, and that it's supposed to help with a number of different kinds of oral hygiene, but in particular, it also helps with dry mouth. So I find it actually to be very, very helpful. There's a few other things. My dentist is always recommending stuff. She'll go to dental conventions, and prior to my being her patient, she never really even paid attention to the things on Sjogren syndrome, and now she always does and goes to anything on dry mouth. So she frequently brings back stuff for me. For my fibromyalgia, I take Savella. And Savella is the only medication that was developed simply for fibromyalgia. Most people that I know of who have fibromyalgia are on one or another antidepressant. And Savella is in the same.
Well, there's also Neurontin, and there's also Lyrica.
And I was on Cymbalta for a while and started having depressive episodes and suicidal thoughts, and therapy off of that. So Savella, which is in the same family, but it's just not, it's never been used to treat depression. I've been on it for quite some time, probably 13, 14 years. And when I first went on it, my rheumatologist was like, this was when I was still in New Jersey. And she's like, I don't have a single patient who can tolerate it, because the abdominal stuff, the side effects are awful. I said, I'd rather try something like that than be running around with suicidal thoughts. So I took the Savella, and it worked. And I've been on it now for quite some time. When I changed doctors or changed insurance coverage a few years ago, they denied covering the Savella, and I was off of it for about 6 weeks. And I had, 30 symptoms of fibromyalgia, to the point where I wrote an appeal letter, overnighted it to them, in which I described what my life was like off of the medication, and how fibromyalgia is so unique to each person that once you find a formula to treat it, don't change it.
Right.
So they approved me the next day and I'm back on it. But I had restless leg syndrome. I was not sleeping. My body I was in so much pain. I could barely move. I had horrific mood swings. I had fibro fog, that sort of, you can't think straight. Worse than I had ever had it. I wound up with symptoms I had never even had before I went on the medication. So I know that my fibromyalgia has gotten worse and worse over time, but this medication is so good for me that it really masks 95% of my symptoms.
That's awesome. I actually have had fibromyalgia for many years after having had Lyme disease. I developed it. And, I did the bite the bullet approach and didn't take anything and just kind of dealt with the pain. But years later, I had some nerve damage as a result of some spinal surgery. So they put me on Lyrica for the nerve pain, which was totally separate from the fibromyalgia. But the punchline was it treated the fibromyalgia. And I felt so much better, even though I still had the nerve pain. It didn't really treat the nerve pain. It took the edge off of it, but it really treated the fibromyalgia. But the best bonus point was I was 55-ish at the time and about to be going through menopause. And I sailed through menopause because it turns out one of the other bonus benefits in some women, not all women, but in some women, it also treats hot flashes. Now, it's not the kind of drug that we would ever recommend just for the treatment of hot flashes. But I thought that I was sailing through menopause, just being a lucky person. I didn't make the connection between, being on the Lyrica also masking that. I did go off of it for a couple of weeks just to see and experiment whether I still needed it. And when I went off of it, I went into full-blown menopause.
Maybe that was what happened with me, because I was also sailing nicely through menopause. And I'm 58 now, and 7 years ago. And then I started spotting a little. And my PCP said, well, that's not normal. We need to go find out what's going on. And I went to my gynecologist, and, after doing this and after doing this and after doing this, the bottom line was I had cancer, and I had endometrial cancer. Thank God it was a very early finding. It was stage 1. I needed only surgery, no chemo, no radiation, no anything, just surgery.
Great.
But because I was off my medication for a while and had a complete hysterectomy, I went into full-blown menopause.
We call that menostop.
Yeah, no pausing anymore. Yeah, I mean, the symptoms.
So just to clarify, you had a hysterectomy, but you also had your ovaries removed.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I had a complete hysterectomy. I have nothing left.
Wow. I'm sorry to hear. I was not prepared for that story.
Yeah.
So I'm very sorry to hear that, but it reminds me then to do a public service announcement based on what you said, that any time you are menopausal age or beyond, and you have any vaginal bleeding, even a couple of drops, spotting here and there, you have to go right to your gynecologist. Do not pass go.
Exactly.
And you went to your PCP, and I assume she referred you.
Yes, and the gynecologist, who is like my spiritual sister, because we just met and bonded. No, I just saw her last week, and I walked in and she looked at me and she said, it was a few days after the Pittsburgh shooting, and I walked in and she just hugged me and said, you've been on my mind. I was going to call you, and then I saw in my appointment book that you were coming in this week, and it was better for me to see you in person than to speak on the phone. We've become very close, and she, you could have easily said, oh, you're just spotting, maybe you weren't fully through menopause, whatever. We can just wait and see if it gets worse. And she's like, no, that's not me. She said, I'm a scientist. We're going to go and find.
Well, and that's the recommendation, is that any spotting in a menopausal woman or a woman who's postmenopausal deserves an endometrial biopsy. And yes, in many women, it's going to be just quote unquote irregular bleeding. But in many women, it's going to be endometrial cancer or a precursor to endometrial cancer, which is endometrial hyperplasia, which is just a fancy name for an overgrowth of the lining of the uterus or the womb. But very often that's a precancerous condition. And the good news is that if it's caught early, as in your case, you can just have a surgical solution. Right.
Fran Drescher was the same for everyone, the nanny, right?
The nanny, right.
The actress, the nanny. She also stage 1, the same thing. One of the interesting things, though, of course, is that once you've had cancer, and I was not surprised. My father had cancer, his mother had cancer, his sister had cancer, his grandfather had cancer, his uncle had cancer. I mean, it's just sort of in our line. So it wasn't a surprise. And they, other than my aunt, they all had gastroenterology enterological cancers. So
that's why we call it GI.
GI cancers. But his mom and everybody else had colon cancer. My father had GE junction cancer. And what I learned was that endometrial cancer is actually related to GI cancers. It's kind of bizarre to learn. It's like a different part of the body. It's not part of the GI system, but it is actually related. So I was tested for something called Lynch Syndrome,
right?
Which I tested negatively for.
Well, that's good.
And what the geneticist said to me was, well, it just means that whatever the genetic component of your family's cancer is, that gene marker hasn't been isolated yet. It doesn't mean,
right.
that it doesn't exist.
So you want to explain to people what Lynch syndrome is?
So Lynch syndrome is something very often seen in people with colon cancer. And it's a genetic marker that, tells you if you're a carrier of it, that you have a much, much higher likelihood. It's like sort of like the BRCA gene for breast cancer. It's the same idea, that a much higher possibility or likelihood of developing colon cancer. But even so, with me, so being now a cancer survivor, and having Sjogren syndrome, because with Sjogren syndrome, there is actually a risk of lymphoma. Patients with Sjogren's have a 40% higher risk than the general population of developing lymphoma. So
I didn't know that.
So I'm a fairly high cancer risk. I remain high. And even my colonoscopies each year or every, I started with the 10 years. Then I went to the 5-year plan. Then I went to the 3-year plan. I think I'm now on the 2-year plan, right? Okay. So each time I go through a colonoscopy, they're finding polyps that are clearly more advanced in the short time frame than they would have been in a 10-year or 5-year. So what you say is, thank God there are tests out there that we can undergo.
Right. And I have to say, I was somebody who put off getting a colonoscopy way longer than I should have. And thank goodness I don't have any risk factors other than now being over 50. But the rule is at 50, if your doctor hasn't told you to get one earlier, you're supposed to get one at 50. And I put it off for about 3 years, which is about the length of time that I generally put off doing anything that I don't want to do. And I was terrified of, and not terrified, but just dreading the prep. And I thought that would be really terrible. But what nobody ever told me on the positive side is that was the best sleep I ever had in my whole life.
Oh, outstanding.
Awesome.
Although I woke up during my last one.
Ooh.
Yeah.
I woke up afterwards and I was annoyed that I thought they hadn't begun yet. I was like, where is everybody? Because they left me in the room. And eventually the nurse came back and I said, tick tock, I have things to do today. And he said, oh, you were done an hour ago, but we just decided to let you sleep.
Yeah, it is. It is good sleep. It is good sleep if you can stay sleeping. I was very annoyed when I woke up.
Oh,
I didn't feel anything, but I could just hear them talking to me. And they decided if I wanted to look, I could watch. I said, no, thank you. I'm a rabbi, not.
Now, do you have siblings?
I have a brother.
I kind of remember that. Okay. And is he up to date on his colonoscopies?
He is. My brother is sort of genetically my mother, and I am more genetically my father. So whereas I get cancer, he gets depression.
Hey. Although it sounds like you had your trial with that as a result of medication.
Yes. I'm in a profession that has its major stresses, and one of the things I have also discovered is that if I'm having a particularly difficult time and it's feeling like it is heading into something that feels like a depression, that because I am on Savella, it helps with the depression as well. And I'm not on the maximum dose of the Savella for my fibromyalgia, so I can actually increase my Savella. And I had to for a while. I was going through a difficult period where my father died, my mother-in-law died 3 months later. So it was a particularly stressful and depressing time for me. And so I did find that actually increasing my Savella was quite helpful, not just for the increased pain from the fibro, but also for the depression.
Now, the first time you and I talked privately, not in the ladies' room, about your autoimmune conditions, you were telling me about this total, complete overhaul you did of your diet.
Yes.
So you want to talk about that?
Sure. That was about 13 years ago. And I decided, I had read an article online by a rheumatologist who said that the majority of his patients can treat some of their symptoms, if not all, depending on how severe or mild they are, through dietary changes. And I thought, I'll give it a try. So so basically I ate like a rabbit for about 3 weeks. I had like lettuce and carrots. That was literally about it. I mean, maybe I had some white rice, nothing else. And what you're really doing is a cleanse. You're just getting every food particle that's in your body that could have an effect on you physically out of your system. And then it was to very slowly reintroduce foods. So I would eat one food, wait 48 hours. If I had any symptom whatsoever, whether it was of my autoimmune conditions or something else, it went on to the unsafe list. And if I felt fine, then it went on to the safe list. If it was on the unsafe list, I waited another 48 hours until the symptoms were gone and added the next food. And it took me 9 months, and then I added some other time for some other foods that I hadn't included the first time. And when I finally was completely done, I discovered that gluten, American gluten, and this is really important, this is only gluten in the United States, really affects me muscularly, my fibromyalgia. I can go anywhere else in the world and eat the gluten fine.
Interesting.
It's really probably not gluten, it's probably really Monsanto. And it is what we do to our...
Or preservative, or...
Yeah, it's the poisons that you spray, it's whatever it is. I cannot eat it in this country. I was out of the country 3 times this year. I was in February. I went to Israel. I ate my way across Israel. Anything I wanted: pita bread, falafel, all of it, ragala, all the great Jewish delicacies. I then went to Montreal with a group of our 8th and 9th grade students. We're closer to Montreal than we are to New York City and up here in New Hampshire. And we do a walking tour of Jewish Montreal that is a food tour. So that the Montreal bagel, very different from the New York bagel, but wonderful. I could eat as many Montreal bagels as I wanted to. In fact, I brought home like 3 dozen of them in my freezer, because every so often I want a bagel. Then this summer we were in London, and again London, you go for Indian food. I could eat all the naan bread I wanted to. I mean, it doesn't matter. It's clearly what we do with food in this country. But I live here, so overwhelmingly I cannot eat any gluten in this country. I also discovered that I cannot eat nightshade vegetables. Nightshades are the generally 4 that are edible are potatoes, tomatoes, eggplant, and all forms of peppers. Not the pepper you grind, but any pepper we grow, plant, bell peppers, all those. And that affects my Sjogren's, because that is joint pain, and severe joint pain. I get, like if I eat a tomato accidentally, I just feel it. I just can't bend my fingers for.
Wow. Yeah,
I'm very sensitive to nightshades. Nightshades are a poisonous plant. They grow at night or in the shade, which is how they get their name. And the overwhelming majority of the population doesn't feel the poison that is in them. But for anybody who has any kind of inflammatory disease, be it osteoarthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, or another kind of connective tissue joint disease, nightshades can be really debilitating for us.
And that's terrible about tomatoes, because they're so high in lycopene and other, anti-inflammatory chemicals which are good for you for so many.
Peppers too. The capsaicin in peppers is also anti-inflammatory. So I will occasionally cheat with hot peppers because I just love hot peppers. And I'll pay for it. My hands will really, it's mostly my hands. I'll hurt, but I'll, I don't do it all that often. I also am affected by peanuts, and that could be also the way we grow them in this country. I don't know, but because it's the same reaction I get with gluten. And those are the major ones for me. There are some other things I discovered that my body just doesn't agree with my body. That has nothing to do with my autoimmune conditions. So there's certain other foods I can't eat, but those are the main ones. And I pretty much much for 13 years, have not eaten those foods. I mean, I've been pretty good about not eating them. So I recommend it to anybody who is looking to be able to not be on, I was on for my Sjogren's, I was actually on a chemotherapy drug. And that was one of the ways to control some of the joint pain was through the chemotherapy drug. And believe me, I'd rather just not eat tomatoes and other nightshades.
All right, then take that.
And be on chemotherapy for the rest of my life, even a low dose, so I recommend it. And it's going to be different for every person. For some people, nightshades will be fine, but it'll be dairy. You just never know. Caffeine.
Well, it'll be fairly easy to go off nightshades for 4 weeks for most people.
Yeah.
It actually might be hard for me to not eat tomatoes for 4 weeks, but the other ones, it would be pretty easy to go.
Yeah. I loved all of them. As a kid, I was known as the potato kid. Like I would forego dessert in order to have an extra helping of any kind of potato you would put in front of me. So that was the hardest one. I learned to love sweet potatoes.
Well, sweet potatoes are not in the same family.
Not at all. They're not nightshades. They are.
But they're much healthier.
They are. Yeah, there's really no healthy aspect of a potato. Just comfort food.
Yes.
You can't comfort yourself with potatoes, and you can't comfort yourself with traditional macaroni and cheese because you can't have gluten. Believe me, you look for other things, which is why.
Well, now there are all these gluten-free pasta alternatives. I just got one that was made by. It's made with garbanzo bean flour.
It was disgusting.
Oh,
somebody made me something with that one. It was vile. It was like eating like a paste that was not edible. It was horrible. No, rice flour ones are fine. But because I can eat gluten from outside the United States, I can actually walk up and down the regular pasta aisle and look for the imported from Italy. And then I can eat it. And I'm fine. I mean, it's not at all anything like a celiac. I mean, that's clearly in a totally different category. I
don't know if you had a chance to listen to a previous episode we did on the podcast with nutritionist Jeannie Petrucci.
No.
Where you have to listen to that as soon as you can, because she's a nutritionist and dietitian. She runs a company called livingplate.org, which she became a nutritionist because she had fibromyalgia. Mm-hmm. And she was experimenting with the effects of her own nutrition on her own symptoms and her own body.
What did she discover?
So we talked a lot about the anti-inflammatory diet, which is essentially a Mediterranean diet. Right. The key in an anti-inflammatory diet is eliminating sugar and processed foods, which are very pro-inflammatory, and really minimizing alcohol. Nobody wants to say eliminate alcohol, but we say minimum. Although, the red wine, I guess, is okay, right. But not if you get migraines from red wine, like I do.
Yeah, I'm blessed that migraines are not one I have. But part of the Mediterranean diet is that there is the tomatoes and a lot of those vegetables that I just absolutely cannot do. But I eat very, 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 very little processed food, and I usually make up a very big salad of fresh vegetables, once a week. In the winter, it might turn into a big soup. I open the crock pot and, find the fresh veggie. I'm a vegetarian by choice. And so I do, lots of big soups and things like that. And then those will last me for a week and a half. And that's how I try to eat, make a big fruit salad every week. And, that might be.
Yeah, I think it really helps and makes life easier to have a big soup in the fridge, just kind of ready to microwave whenever you need it.
Exactly.
Or what I call the never-ending salad bowl.
Right. Yeah.
Just if things are prepared and in the fridge and ready. And that doesn't mean you have to make it. You can also purchase it.
Right.
So I think there've been a lot of lessons in this. We've certainly covered a lot of territory, but a few things that I want to underscore from, what other people who are listening can learn from this. I think the first thing is with many diagnoses and many chronic conditions, and particularly many autoimmune diseases, it's very rare that you can go to one doctor one time who can make the diagnosis right away. And that's not because these doctors are not competent or because they're not compassionate or they're not comprehensive. It's because many times these diseases are evolving. And, undifferentiated is a great word. They haven't just fully manifest. I talked to a woman the other day who had bizarre symptoms for a really long time. And she said she went to at least 10 doctors. And eventually she went to a doctor who said, "What do you think you have?" And she said, "I'm just worried that I have multiple sclerosis." And he did an MRI of her brain. And sure enough, that's what she had. But it was still pretty mild at that point. Many times also you have to go to different types of doctors. So you started with a dermatologist. Most people will start with their primary care physician, but ultimately you have to get to the specialist in the area that it is. And many times we don't know what that is. And
can I share something about,
of course,
about Sjogren's in particular? The Sjogren Syndrome Foundation, one of their goals is to reduce the time between symptom and diagnosis because of how long it takes. It used to be on average that people would go almost 7 years between their first symptom and their diagnosis, and their goal is to reduce it to 3. I mean, could you imagine still trying to figure out what you have after 3 years?
I can imagine that.
Yeah. So that's one of the whole purposes behind the foundation, is even to just get practitioners to become more familiar with the disease, because it's even just one that not even a lot of practitioners know.
Right. It's not the most common. I actually have to tell you a funny story. I was actually at a fundraiser event years ago for my children's school. And it was one of those events where everybody gets a name tag. And I met this gentleman, and his name tag said his last name was Sjogren. And I was just being flip. And I said, "Oh, are you related to Dr. Sjogren of Sjogren syndrome?" And he's like, "Yes, that was my grandfather." Everybody asks me that. So that was one way to increase awareness.
Yeah, that certainly was.
I did want to say kind of upfront that it's named after the person who discovered it, like, many of these diseases.
Right.
The other point I want to, the other take home message I want to give to other people is that even now that you have a diagnosis, you mentioned all these different doctors and other ancillary healthcare providers who you have to follow up with. One of the things that I've always, reminded people about having any kind of chronic illness is it's like having a part-time job. You really have to be diligent about going back for all these follow-up appointments. And many people need physical therapy or aquatic therapy or massage on a regular basis, or these other therapies, or they really need to ramp up paying attention to things like their diet or their sleep. Now, how does sleep affect you, and how religious are you, pun intended, about, getting a healthy sleep regimen to manage your fibromyalgia?
I'm not as good as I should be. I should try and get a little bit more sleep than I do. Luckily, I'm a pretty decent sleeper, so once I fall asleep, I might wake up once to go to the bathroom, but I'm usually able to fall back asleep pretty easily.
That's also part of being a 58-year-old woman.
Yeah, exactly. There are, some of the pieces are which one is disease, which one is just the natural process of aging, being 58, being postmenopausal, being all of those.
So I always say, if you get up at night to go to the bathroom once, that's within the realm of normal. But if it's twice or more, then it's time to talk to your doctor about that.
Or to change your habits right before bedtime.
Exactly. Or after 5 o'clock. We had a great segment with Dr. Michael Bruce, who is the sleep doctor, where we talked about all kinds of sleep-related health issues. And he actually tells people to stop having caffeine after 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
I do not do caffeine later than that.
But I think, for everybody, and of course, caffeine is not on the anti-inflammatory diet. Caffeine can be very pro-inflammatory.
I don't drink coffee. I'll have like a cup of tea a day.
Mm-hmm. Tea is wonderful.
Yeah.
Tea is absolutely wonderful. And there's all kinds of teas and decaf and herbal. So anyway, I could talk to you all day long, but I have to let you go. Is there any one thing that, you just want to remind people about, or your take-home imparting message?
Your body is yours. You know it the best. If a practitioner suggests something to you that doesn't sound consistent with what makes sense for your body, you don't have to follow it. That doesn't mean to ignore the good advice, but just to always remember your body is yours and you know it better than anybody else, and listen to your body.
I think that is great advice. And then, of course, the corollary to that is you only get one.
Yes.
This is the only one you got.
That's right. That's right.
So take care of it. Anyway, Robin, thank you so much for coming and talking to us in the ladies' room. Such a pleasure. And I know everybody else enjoyed it as much as I did.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
That's all we have time for today. But let's keep the conversation going on Twitter or Facebook at Dr. Dunica. And please join us next week for another episode of In the Ladies' Room with Dr. Dunica. Real conversations with real women about really intimate topics.